how does it all work for the Russians? How does it work for Vladimir Putin? He doesn't have an endless supply of money and an endless supply of people. Um, and these things, when they do come undone, they come undone very quickly. If you remember, we all thought that Assad was going to be running Syria for the next 30 years, and then all of a sudden, in 1 week, a group of rebels, um, uh, you know, took over the country. And so, I can't predict that in my crystal ball, but in a situation where this war carries on, Putin doesn't have indefinite resources to do this, and so we'll see.
Donald Trump keeps talking about the casualties and reducing it, and that's why he's trying to push for peace and everything else, rather than it being the Nobel Peace Prize, if I was being cynical. What do you think he's going to make of this 1 million milestone? Because we haven't heard anything out of the White House when we're recording this. It may come later.
Well, I think he's pretty busy right now, sending out his own military to Los Angeles to supposedly quell the riots about the immigration enforcement. So he's not really paying attention to all the dead bodies in the Russian military. The one thing that I would say is that if he does, he said in the past he's very upset by all the killing that's going on, all the young men that are dying. First of all, I don't believe that, but let's just take him at face value. If he is so upset, then the last thing he should be doing is withdrawing Patriot missile defense. Apparently, the United States under Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, has said that they're no longer going to provide military aid. They've just rerouted a bunch of drone defense that was supposed to be sent to Ukraine, 20,000 weapons from Ukraine to the Middle East. And so there are, I could list on a piece of paper all the different things that they're doing to create more death, not less death, in Ukraine and in Russia. And so I don't think that we can take it at face value that Donald Trump is in his heart very sad and concerned about the number of young men dying in battle in Russia.
And with that numbers, do you think Vladimir Putin is part of the reason why the people aren't rising up is he's buying their silence? Because a lot of the casualties are coming from the extremely poor parts of Russia, and the monies that are being given and other things that are being given to the families as compensation for those that get formally declared as killed in action. There's a lot of action to try and stop lots of people being declared as that, is massive for people. And that in its way is, it's initially buying silence, but it's building up a problem that Putin is going to have to deal with at some stage in the future from an economic perspective.
Well, there's all sorts of different issues with that. First of all, they don't have an unlimited amount of money in Russia. The oil revenues are down. Gas revenues have dried up completely because they're not exporting gas to Europe. The central bank reserves are frozen. There's all sorts of economic problems. It's not like they have money to just slosh around. They do have money, but not that kind of money. The second thing is that the reason why a lot of people have gone to war is because they were paid money. They were paid enormous sign-on bonuses to effectively go to war and die. And doing that kind of recruiting, they've effectively emptied out the provinces, the poor provinces. If you go to Moscow and you look at the number of people who have been killed in this war versus Buratria or Ingushetia, which are very poor provinces, the numbers are like 10 or 15 times higher in the poor provinces. And that works for a while until all the people who you could sign up in the poor provinces have already signed up and died. And then where do you get the next round of soldiers from? And that's going to be a problem, because when you bring this war closer to the elite, to the middle class, to the people in the wealthier cities, those people have more political power than people who are destitute, who are living in far off regions that are very poor. And so that creates a problem. The one thing I can say is that Putin has been so careful about, first of all, calling this a war. He calls it a special military operation, and of course imprisons people who call it a war. And the reason he is that way is because if it's called a war and then he starts recruiting soldiers or demanding conscripting soldiers in Moscow and St. Petersburg, then it really is a war. And then the general population has to say, are we ready to be at war? Why are we at war? What's this war about? What do we get from it? And then they see, well, actually, we're not getting a whole lot from it. All we're getting is a lot of death, a lot of economic pain. And why are we fighting these people in Ukraine? They're practically like our brothers and sisters over there. What's this about? How is it that they're our enemies? And I think that that's what he's afraid of, which is why he doesn't want to do a general conscription, and that's why he pays poor people in the regions who, by the way, are of a totally different ethnicity. These are not the sort of the brothers and sisters, people intermarried, et cetera. These are people with different ethnic backgrounds entirely, and but he's got a problem because at some point he's got to then ratchet it up, and how does he do that in a way that doesn't end up having the Russian population eventually question him, and that's his challenge.
Yeah, but the war is coming home. Donald Trump, whenever JD Vance ambushed Zelensky in the Oval Office, and Donald Trump then picked up that ambush and drove it home, turning around and saying to President Zelensky, "You don't have any cards to play." Well, I think we've seen a few aces recently with the Operation Spider's Web attacking Russian strategic bombers, the Kerch Bridge being attacked again, daily attacks on Russian defense industry, and a number of other audacious attacks, including the assassination of generals in Moscow. They can't keep that from the people in the same way, especially as it's being discussed all over Russian Telegram channels. What sort of effect do you think that that's having on, again, the Russian people and more personally to Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think it's a total shock and humiliation to Vladimir Putin. I mean, he doesn't have a very good military. He never has. Remember, they launched this 3-day war, and then all of their tanks got stuck in the mud, and all the soldiers were killed. And of course, they have had a huge advantage for a long time during this war, actually because of Biden, not because of Trump, who said you can fight back and use the weapons that we provide you as long as you don't use them inside Russian territory. And the Ukrainians really needed the weapons because there was a lot of stuff coming at them from all different directions. And they used the weapons and were grateful for the weapons, but were basically fighting with one hand tied behind their backs because how do you fight a war against an enemy if you can't hit them in their own territory when they're amassing, large movements of troops on the other side of the border and so on and so forth. And so the irony here is that even though Biden was providing weapons, he provided this, or he put on this terrible constraint on the Ukrainians. So Trump is not providing weapons, but in doing so, he doesn't have the moral authority to tell them, don't, if you do something that we tell you shouldn't do by hitting them inside their own territory, we're going to withhold weapons because they've already withheld weapons. And so the Ukrainians were able to do some audacious things, this Operation Spiderweb of taking out a third of the strategic bombers of Russia, $7 billion worth of weapons using a bunch of $500 drones. I mean, it is a historic act of military genius that they couldn't have done if we had told them to stop or not hit targets inside of Russian territory. And so the Ukrainians have really shown that they have cards. I don't think Trump is happy with that because Trump seems to want to have the Ukrainians surrender and have a new joint military economic alliance with Russia. But that doesn't seem to be, it's not going his way in the same way as it didn't go Putin's way with the war ending in 3 days.
So we have to push America away, or they're pushing themselves away, and Europe has to take over. But within that, we have to understand how we can then properly influence and take control of the initiative around Vladimir Putin. How do we get that political initiative over Putin?
Well, I think that the most important thing that we need to do in order to create a real deterrence is that we need to go and confiscate the $300 billion of frozen Russian assets that sit in EU and UK bank accounts that we have frozen. We should confiscate that money, and that money should be the defense fund for defending Ukraine. And then that money should be used to fund the purchase of highly lethal weapons that the Ukrainians can use to fire on Russia to push them back. And then beyond that, we should, instead of doing these incremental sanctions, which we've done, we should just make it illegal for any of our trading partners to buy Russian oil. To say, if you buy Russian oil, we're not going to trade with you anymore, and you choose. And I think a lot of people will say, you know what, Russian, it's great to have some cheap Russian oil, but we don't want to lose the European markets and the UK market, et cetera. And if they did that, then Putin would be pretty quickly out of business. And we could do that without the United States. I mean, the United States is very important. We need the United States. It's much more expensive and painful and deadly if the United States is not involved. But the United States is not the only game in town. The economies of the UK plus Europe are nearly the size of the U.S. economy. The amount of military equipment that we have collectively, is way more than what Russia has. And so it's an absurdity to think that we can't fight back, we can't help Ukraine, we can't create problems for Vladimir Putin. But we do have this one issue, which is that there's so many different countries in this block of neighbors. There's 27 member states. There are some who are on Putin's side. It's a very difficult coalition to cobble together. But there's a few very important members of the coalition, Germany in particular, with a new chancellor who's just approved $1 trillion defense budget to rearm, who make up a very powerful ally. And of course, the French, who have their own nuclear weapons that are independent of the United States, and so on and so forth. And so I don't think this is an impossibility, but it's all, a totally new game, a new expensive game that we have to play because of Donald Trump pulling out of this Western alliance.
Okay, so finally, you've got your crystal ball sitting in front of you. How do you see the rest of this year playing out, and what's coming in the next couple of years?
I see this year playing out that the U.S. will formally pull out of funding Ukraine, military aid for Ukraine. I see the U.S. will be perhaps withdrawing troops from NATO bases in Europe. I see that the expense of this war will be borne by Europe and the United Kingdom. I see the money being frozen by Russia, frozen by the West of Russia, the $300 billion, that we start to confiscate that money. And I see the war being as hot and as unpleasant at the end of the year as it is today. I don't think the war is going to come to an end anytime soon. And the one thing that I can't predict, though, is how does it all work for the Russians? How does it work for Vladimir Putin? He doesn't have an endless supply of money and an endless supply of people. And these things, when they do come undone, they come undone very quickly. If you remember, we all thought that Assad was going to be running Syria for the next 30 years, and then all of a sudden, in 1 week, a group of rebels, took over the country. And so, I can't predict that in my crystal ball, but in a situation where this war carries on, Putin doesn't have indefinite resources to do this, and so we'll see.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.